All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. And so last week we kind of talked about, this is a funny story. I have to tell you this funny story. So I did the thing last week, and Terry in the car said, Scott, that was one of the best ones you think you've really done. It was really super interesting. And so we get home, and I'm looking at the videotape, and there's no sound. The microphone wasn't turned on. So I like Charlie Chaplin up there doing the thing, and there's absolutely no sound. And so she says, you should just re-record it. And so okay, well, I came up. Anyway, I put it up on the TV, and set up everything, get 15 minutes into it, and Terry's walking through the kitchen, which is where the thing was sitting, the camera. She's like, this isn't recording. So then I had to start over, reset it all, did it again, got to like 10 minutes left, and then the camera ran out of battery, or the phone battery died. So I've done the lecture from last week like 4 times now, so I could do it by heart.
I have to tell you a funny story. So last week, when I do the altar guild for the 11:15, I have to leave a little early to make sure the candles are lit and all. So when you send the thing out, it's like, I'll get to watch the end of the lecture. Yeah. So I went all the way to the end.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't see the beginning and I'm not a very observant person and never have been. So I'm watching this thing for a couple of minutes, and all of a sudden I'm like, wait a minute. Where are the windows?
Yeah. It's like, that's not the church.
And I thought maybe with some like technology where you
No, it was lack of technology. My inability to turn the microphone on. So okay, well, so we talked about, we were getting ready to kind of dive into historical Jesus. So we kind of mentioned briefly that when you start looking at what manuscripts do we have to base this on, and I think the point of all of this is for the 100 years after Jesus' death, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 little pieces of manuscript that look like that. That's it, and that's for 100 years following Jesus' death. We don't start getting complete manuscripts until 340 of the Common Era, 300, 340. So now you're 200 years when you're getting these copies of the original manuscripts. Now we know that they were written closer to Jesus' time, but all that we have left, but they were writing on papyri, right? Papyri is the reeds out of the ocean, and they'd weave them together and kind of create, but they're also highly erodible. So, we've lost a lot of the early manuscripts. But I think the important point that I was really trying to make with that is sometimes we can't get too super dogmatic about what's in there because we don't have the original text. And that's even if you assume that the original text had some special meaning beyond that, but we just have copies of copies and little bits, and this tradition was an oral tradition as well as a written tradition, and so we see in the manuscripts scribal changes and scribal errors. So I think it's important that when we study this and we read the Bible, we have to keep in mind all of these nuances and not get too dogmatic about what it is we're reading and kind of look at it in the big picture. Okay, so the historical Jesus. And I love pictures and art, so I thought I'd start with a little bit. So this is a medieval, early medieval, or maybe a little before the medieval times, pictures of Jesus, Da Vinci's Last Supper, pictures of Jesus. You see a trend here of what Jesus, how we've envisioned Jesus to look. Very Western European. The Dinner at Emmaus by Caravaggio. Rembrandt, a Jesus who's very Western looking, very white, European. And then we get to modern Jesus, surfer dude Jesus from Jesus Christ Superstar. And it's like, I'm pretty 99% sure that Jesus didn't look, and then I think my own personal best Jesus is the one from, I can't remember the guy's name, but from The Chosen. He probably has the most, from all the things I've read, at least kind of an authentic look to him. Although all of the commonality of all these Jesuses is they all have long hair. And most of the scholars are like, that's probably not. Most Jewish men in the ancient world did not, unless they were a Nazarite, who, like Samson, they kept their hair fairly short. Kind of like the Romans. They just didn't have a lot of, so I don't know. I wasn't there, but that's what I read. So I think it's important that we, our conception, my conception at least, automatically goes to some form of one of these pictures when I start thinking about Jesus. And what we really need to think about is a Middle Eastern Jewish teacher. That's what Jesus was. And so, and we can't, and they lived in a completely different culture in a completely different time. It's not the same. We can't take our modern Western mentality and lay it over Jesus, even though we do that all the time, and it's kind of just the natural thing humans do. I mean, it's just kind of part of our, we want to try to relate, so we take what we know and we lay it over things that we're unfamiliar with. But we just want to kind of keep that in mind. And then this is a really cool one. So this is from the Catacombs of Rome. This is by most archaeologists and scholars think that this is the oldest there's three paintings like this down in the catacombs under Rome that date back to the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era, and that these are the oldest paintings of Jesus that exist. And in all three of them, the commonality is Jesus, good morning. Oh, you're fine. Come on across.
Yeah.
The comfortable chairs are over here.
I need it with my back, thanks.
They're all pictured as the Good Shepherd, right? Jesus has the lamb around his neck, almost David-like. We kind of get used to seeing David pictured like this as the shepherd, and Jesus is pictured as the Good Shepherd as well. So that was the early motifs of Jesus were very much, pastoral and shepherding, caring for people. And then we talked a little bit last week about, the things we know outside of the Gospels. And I won't redo the list. If you want to see the full list, you can go watch the infamous video on YouTube and see all the starts and stops. But this is it. These two slides contain all the things that we know about Jesus from Paul, the New Testament, Jewish writers, Roman sources, within 100 years of Jesus's life and death. So anything else we know about Jesus has to come from the Gospels, or it is a much, much later tradition that started in the 2nd or even late 2nd century and into the 3rd. By the time the Jesus movement had morphed into Christianity and really started growing, all sorts of writings and documents about Jesus started. So once you get to 400 CE, there's all sorts of stuff you can read. Many not very historical, and many not very, they're all kind of extrapolations. So there's not birth narratives, but childhood narratives of Jesus, where Jesus creates little clay pigeons and then brings them to life, and the pigeons fly off. There's a childhood scene written in the 300s or 400s of Jesus playing with his playmates, and he gets mad at them, and he curses one of them, and he falls over dead, and just, all sorts of kind of crazy things.
What are those sources?
Those sources are Christian and Jewish writings about Jesus from the 3rd, 4th, 5th century CE. So later than the New Testament, much later than the New Testament times, but pretty old, traditions. And I think people during that time were, as Christianity was really developing, were exploring, thought experiments of, they're still figuring out who Jesus is. What does this whole Jesus thing mean? What's the purpose of Jesus? Is it, we all say, famously, last year we were talking about in the class theology, and we talked about salvation, and it's like, what are we saved from? How are we saved? We say those things all the time. I've been saved by Jesus, but what does that mean? What are we being saved from? How are we saved? How does all that work? People were trying to figure all of that out. How is Jesus God when there's only one God, but Jesus is God, and the Holy Spirit is God, and so you end up with this Trinitarian philosophical construct that gets built to be able to explain it all. But that was the big, I think most people would say that was one of the, at least theological wedges that got driven between the Jesus movement and the Jewish religion, was this idea that Jesus was somehow divine, because that was just a no-go, a red line for the Jews. They're like, there's only one God, and none of us, including Jesus, is God. So this constant statement of Jesus is divine, Jesus is divine, was what theologically, I think there were some other things going on as well that kind of drove wedges between them. Sociology, how do you say that word? Sociologically, maybe, and economically, that helped drive the division. But philosophically and religiously, theologically, the whole idea that Jesus was somehow divine was a non-starter for Jews. Okay, so if we're going to base our discussion off of trying to figure out what the historical Jesus really was, what was Jesus like when he walked and talked on the earth, we have to look at what our sources are. And our sources are Mark, which is our earliest source, the Gospel of Mark. It was written around 70 of the Common Era, so 40 years or so, 35 to 40 years after Jesus' death. Matthew and Luke came about 15 or 20 years later. They're more or less contemporary. And Matthew and Luke use Mark as a primary source. And I'll talk about that a little more in a little bit. And then the last gospel came around the turn of the first century into the early second century, which is the Gospel of John. And if you've ever heard, been in other Sunday school classes or within the church, you'll often hear Matthew, Mark, and Luke being referred to as the synoptic gospels. And that's because they kind of fit together fairly nicely. And I think that's because Matthew and Luke borrowed the basic storyline from Mark as they wrote their gospels. They're not the same as Mark. They've changed things and emphasized, bring in additional information, but they all follow kind of the basic storyline. John's just out doing his own thing. Most scholars think that you in the ancient world, while there was travel, much more travel than in the ancient world because of the Roman roads and the Roman peace, it made it easier to move around the Roman Empire, but it was not a common thing. You couldn't send email. It took a long time to get stuff out to people. So you ended up with communities kind of working in isolation. And so most scholars would say that John was a gospel written, maybe they had some of the oral traditions from these other communities, but they were kind of just doing their own thing and they wrote their own gospel. And it's, again, you can follow the basic pathway, but it's significantly different. So we'll often talk about the synoptics and then the Gospel of John.
Where does Paul fit on this?
Paul, I took Paul out just for clarity, but Paul is right in here between 50 and 60. So all of Paul's letters were all written and completed by, and he was executed by 60 of the Common Era. So the authentic letters of Paul are the oldest documents that are in the New Testament. followed shortly after that by the Gospel of Mark. So if you laid them out, all of the New Testament letters on a timeline, it would be the letters of Paul, and then right after that, Mark, and then the others kind of all fill in. And I think it's Timothy or Peter. I can't remember which one is actually the last, most scholars. And these are all speculations. I mean, scholars debate, which ones. And some scholars say the Bible didn't get finished until close to 200 of the Common Era. Others say, oh, no, it was all written before 100. So, there's a lot of debate as to how you date these books. Yes?
Okay, so Paul is not, all his letters are not one person. I've heard that Paul and then some of his scribes and some of his students and a whole bunch of people.
Right.
I'm using his name, if you will.
So a common thing that happened in the ancient world was called pseudepigraphy, which is writing something, it's kind of like writing in the style of someone else. And so the best modern example I can think of is James Bond. So Ian Fleming, back in the late 50s and 60s, wrote all these James Bond novels, and everybody loves James Bond. And then they make movies out of all the James Bond books, and now they're like, now what do we do? And there's a whole genre that's brought up of people writing new James Bond stories in the style of Ian Fleming. But in our modern society, we say, Scott Burch, a James Bond thriller by Scott Burch. I didn't write one, but if I did, but it's in the style of Ian Fleming. Well, that's what they did in the ancient world as well. So there's 7 of the letters that are attributed to Paul that are considered authentic, that Paul actually wrote. And when I say wrote, in some cases we think he dictated, because in the letter, it gets to a certain point in the letter, and then Paul says, I'm writing this last part in my own hand. See how big the letters are. And so that has led scholars to think maybe Paul didn't have good eyesight, or maybe Paul wasn't very good at writing. Not everybody, you could have very intellectual people who were illiterate. They couldn't read or write. Or maybe he could read okay, but his writing wasn't very good. Scribal work was a tedious profession, but it was only a small group of people who could do that kind of work. And then there's about 5 Pauline letters that are purportedly to be from Paul that most scholars think are not from Paul. And the reason for that is in the early letters that we know Paul wrote, Paul was very adamant. Jesus is coming soon. The end is upon us. We won't, people were getting worried about the people in their congregations and their friends who are dying. And he's like, don't worry, because even those who have died will be resurrected. So you're going to see him again really soon, because when Jesus comes back. And then you get to the later letters, and now it's all about, oh, you should set up bishops, and you should set up deacons, and here's how you organize a church. And it's like, Paul was not about organizing churches. Paul was about, let's move on with action. So that's what drives the scholars to say, even though it says this letter's from Paul, the theological developments and some of the things that are being talked about in these letters are so different than what we know the early Pauline letters were, that it's clearly something that was written later in Paul's name.
How many are there?
There's, like I said, there's 7, okay, I can't completely quote me on the numbers. There's 7 authentic ones that all scholars say, yes, these were truly written by Paul. I think there's 5 that are not written by Paul, and then there's 2 or 3 that it's really iffy. If they were not written by Paul, they were written like right after his death, or there's 3 that there's the jury's out. But the majority of scholars agree there's 7 he did write, 5 he didn't write, and then 2 or 3 in the middle, something like that. My numbers might not be 100% right, but something like that. The most important thing to remember is the way the books are laid out in the Bible, when you open up your Bible, is not in order. There's not an order of development of ideas or thematic development or historical timeline development. It is not like that at all. The letters of Paul are in there from that. When they organized the Bible, they took the longest one and put it first, and they took the shortest one and made it last, and it goes from longest to shortest. So it doesn't have anything to do with timeline or themes or anything like that. I wish they would make a Bible that's kind of laid out more historically, but that would be cool. That would be a fun project. I know this is going to get into the weeds, but again, it's really important to understand the historical Jesus. So I talked about Mark being the first gospel, and scholars say are pretty united that that's the case. Matthew and Luke incorporate all of Mark. Basically, 97% of Mark is somewhere in either Matthew or Luke. So they take all of that, but they move stories around, they add additional information to the stories, they change certain details. And then there's some things in these scholars, and they look and they say, hey, there's some material in Luke that only appears in Luke. It doesn't appear in Matthew, John, or Mark. So it's unique to Luke, and the same for Matthew. But then they find that when you look at Matthew and Luke, there's a chunk of material that's almost identical. It's very, very similar. It's not in Mark, it's not in John, it's not in Paul, but it's only in these two Gospels. So what that leads scholars to think is that there was another document that Matthew and Luke were using as a source. And this theory was put together in the 1800s by three German Christian scholars. I am not even going to try to say their names. Friedrich, how do you say it? Schleiermacher, Christian Hermann Weiss, and Johannes Weiss. But I had to look this up. Johannes and Christian are not related to each other, different Weisses. And they came up with this idea that common material is from another source. And so they named that source Quella. And while you say, oh, that is really, what a cool word. Quella is the German word for source. So all they said is, we'll just call it the source. But scholars have kind of hung on to that, and you will hear, or if you read a lot or see YouTube videos or go to sermons, maybe not sermons, but teaching, you'll hear about Q sometimes. Oh, Q says this, and scholars think that is a document of sayings that Jesus said, things that he said, that Matthew and Luke used as a source to bring that information in. And here's our three German guys. Christian, he's kind of grumpy. I mean, it's like, at least Johannes has his kid with him in his picture, but it's like, all right. So in other words, when Matthew and Luke, and one last just qualifier, we don't know who wrote any of these Gospels. None of them say it doesn't say, oh, hey, I'm Matthew, I'm writing this Gospel down. They were attributed to these different people. There was a whole push as Christianity the canon started getting formed and you were moving towards the Council of Nicaea to kind of formalize the canon, that, you had letters of Paul. Well, Paul was an apostle, so we need to have that. So somehow these Gospels that everybody liked needs to have some connection to somebody who knew Jesus. And so they all get connected to Jesus or Paul somehow. But we don't really know that. And most scholars think that those are just afterthoughts. But it's hard to say by the writer formerly known as Matthew or whatever, So we'll just stick with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. But basically, Mark is in both Matthew and Luke. Q is in both Matthew and Luke. Those are, and this is important because when we go to evaluate whether something is actually historical. And there's no way to prove any of this. So it's all of us sitting down and having some critical thinking and reasoning. But we need to have some way to evaluate that. So one of the things scholars say is earlier sources are more likely, not 100%, but more likely to be closer to accurate than much later sources. So if you went home this afternoon and wrote an email to somebody and said, this is what we did in church today. Okay, that it was written on the day that you did it. That's probably going to be closer to what actually happened than if you sat down and wrote an email 10 years from now. Oh, 10 years ago, I went to Sunday school and there was this guy and he said this and that. You know, it might be accurate, it might not, but we know that the one that was written the day of is maybe a little more likely to be accurate. Independent attestation. So think about, that's a big fancy word, but what it means is if you go to court, let's say you get accused of running a stoplight, and you go to court and it's your word versus the police officer, and nobody else saw it, there's no other evidence, the judge has to decide, do I believe the police officer or do I believe the driver? Because there's no other. But if you come in and say, oh, Scott ran the red light, the police officer says it, he pulls out a picture from the traffic camera, and there's 3 other witnesses who saw me run that red light, then you're going to give that more credibility. It's like, wow, all these people saw that. That's most likely going to be an accurate representation. So if you can say, Mark said this, Mark talked about Jesus in this way, Q talked about Jesus in this way, John talked about Jesus in this way, you're starting to build a kind of a consensus that multiple people, but you can't do it, you can't say that if Matthew's quoting Mark, you can't just say, well, now that's 2 people, because all Matthew's doing is saying, well, this is what Mark said. So you have to look at and try to separate a little bit the independence. This is for all you guys when you go to do your PhDs next year. There's a criterion called dissimilarity, and I've also heard it called the criterion of embarrassment. That is a criteria where you say, we understand that these Gospels are not being written as historical documents. They're theological documents, and the whole point of them writing this is to convince the reader to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, right? It's not kind of an objective history. So why would you put in there that Jesus got executed by the Romans? Your Messiah got executed by the Romans? That's terrible. If you're writing a propaganda tract to try to convince people to come to your side, why would you say that? Well, the reason is it's an inconvenient truth. It happened, everybody knows it happens, they just have to suck it up and deal with it somehow. And then they spin it a different way. And so they say, yeah, he got executed by the Romans, but it was really the Jews who pushed Pilate into it. And oh, by the way, Jesus was resurrected 3 days later. So they weave it into their narrative of their story, but they can't escape it. So if you look for things that it's like, why would a Christian or why would a Jesus follower say that? That doesn't kind of fit into their arguments. And we saw the same thing with David, like when we were talking about David and Bathsheba. That's much more likely to be maybe an accurate story because they just couldn't get around the fact that happened, So, and then the context. We have to think about things in the context in which they occurred. So I have a few examples. So I know that's a little scholarly or nebulous sometimes. Earliest sources. So if you open your Bible and you read Mark 1:41, the verse says, this is where Jesus comes across this lame person who's asking Jesus to be healed. He's been lame since birth. And he says to Jesus, if you want to, you can heal me. And Mark 1:41 says, moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I'm willing, be clean. wow, that's a nice story. The guy comes to Jesus, expresses faith, Jesus feels bad for him, and then heals him. But if you look at the footnotes, and then in some modern translations, they're beginning to flip this, most of all the earliest sources of Mark don't say pity, they say anger. So the verse becomes, moved with anger, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I'm willing, be clean. That's a different, it doesn't change the overall arch of the story of the guy getting healed, but what was Jesus angry about? Was he angry at the guy for saying something to him? Was he angry that this had happened to Jesus? He wasn't moved with compassion or pity. And depending on which version of the Bible you read, the NIV, New International Version, the New Revised Standard Version, the King James Version, different versions will have the different word. They'll pick which word they think is most appropriate. But in every single one of them, there'll be a footnote at the bottom, and they'll say, other ancient authorities say whatever the other word is. So if I go and look in the current version of the New Revised Standard Version, it says moved with pity. And then there's a note, and it says other ancient manuscripts say anger. But if I go to the New International Version, it'll say moved with anger, and the footnote says other ancient manuscripts say pity. Which one is it? I don't know. But you kind of have to think about this. And most scholars are moving to support the moved with anger because it is in the earliest documents, copies of Mark that we have. Does that make sense?
The definitions of words change, so.
Right. That's right. These are all translations of Greek words into English words. So you're also getting some translation effect as well. Sometimes it's pity, sometimes it's compassion. We kind of have different meanings between pity and compassion. The criteria of independent attestation. This is an easy one. Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. It's in Mark. It's in John. It's in Paul. It's in Q. So you have multiple sources saying that Jesus got baptized by John the Baptist. So it's most likely a actual historic event that happened to Jesus. It's also one of the criteria of dissimilarity, and we're going to talk about this a little bit in a minute. But when you get baptized by somebody in the ancient world, it kind of means you're one of their followers. So Jesus got baptized by John. Does that mean he's a follower of John? That's kind of weird. But they can't get away from the fact that they know that happened and that everybody else knows that that happened. And so they have to address it. Same thing with the crucifixion. We just talked about that. And then the last one is keeping in mind the context. So in John chapter 3, verse 1 to 10, this is the famous story of Jesus and Nicodemus, right? So Jesus goes and he's talking to Nicodemus, who's a Pharisee, and they're talking in Jerusalem. And Jesus said, and Nicodemus says, what do I have to do to have eternal life? And Jesus says, you have to be born anothen. Anothen, that's the Greek word. This Greek word is a very interesting word because it has, kind of like some English words, two different meanings. One meaning is from above. The other meaning is again, do it again. So Jesus says you have to be born anothen. He says you have to be born from above. You have to have a spiritual birth from God to get eternal life. But Nicodemus hears you have to be anothen, and he says you have to be born again. And he's like, born again? You want me to climb back into my mother's womb and come out again? It's a little play on words to drive home kind of this spiritual Jesus, and the literary point is Jesus is talking about stuff and people just don't understand what he's talking about. He's saying you got to be born from above, and everybody thinks you got to go back and become a baby again. That doesn't make any sense. Great story. Fun play on words. it only works in the Greek because Jesus most likely spoke Aramaic, as did most Jews during this time. So Jesus, a Jewish teacher, is talking to Nicodemus, a Jewish Pharisee, in Jerusalem, which is the capital of the Jews, the Jewish capital. They're likely speaking either Aramaic or Hebrew, not Greek. It's possible they speak Greek, but most likely not. And if they were speaking Aramaic, the word from above and the word again are two completely separate words. So this little play on words doesn't work.
Which is the oldest language?
Well, the Aramaic, most scholars would say this is a later addition, and not a historical event, because it presupposes that these guys were speaking Greek to make the whole little piece work. So, lots of things to think about. Again, the big picture is, this is why when I recommend reading the Bible, you don't get a little small Bible or one with no footnotes. You need a Bible, a good study Bible with footnotes and stuff at the bottom, because you can read the footnotes and some of the other explanatory information, and it kind of clarifies some of these statements. The other thing that we need to think about is, like I said earlier, these Gospels were written as religious texts, as theological texts, not biographies. And so there's a big fancy word called Christology. Anybody heard Christology before? Cora's heard of Christology. Christology is the idea of how is Jesus divine? It's the study. If you're a Christologic scholar, you're studying Jesus' divinity. How did Jesus become divine? How does that work? And so if you have a low Christology, that's very much just human Jesus, right? Jesus is walking around and he's hungry and he eats and he gets angry and he turns over the tables. That's a low Christology, because he's very human. And then if you have a really high Christology, it's Jesus walking around, the Father and I are one, I am from the Father, I'm here to save your sins. He really makes the case that he's God. John, the Gospel of John, has a very, very high Christology. If you read John, all through John, Jesus knows he's God from the second, within 2 or 3 words of the first verse. Jesus is God. That's kind of laid out. And Jesus, through his speeches and dialogue and the things he does, all of it is driving home the point that Jesus is God. Mark isn't like that. Mark, we just saw, he's angry. He's frustrated. They have my favorite verse in Mark is he goes to heal the blind man. So he spits on the ground creates some mud, turns it, rubs it in his hand to put it as a salve, and he puts it on the guy's eyes, leaves it there for a few minutes, and then wipes it off and says, "Can you see?" And the guy's like, kinda. I see things moving around. They're kind of like trees. And Jesus is like, and he has to do it again. He has to do the miracle twice to make it to work the whole time. So very low Christology. So as we read these stories, we have to understand that as we go from Mark to Matthew and Luke and up to John, we're also seeing in there the development, because they happen. This is the chronological time frame, but you also see this idea that Jesus is God getting more and more evident as you read the stories. Mark says Jesus is God. It's not that Mark denies Jesus is not divine, but it's not as big a deal to him as it is for John. Okay, so let's walk through some of the things that we can say definitively or relatively definitively about Jesus. Number one, Jesus was from Nazareth. This is independently attested in all of the Gospels. It's in Mark, it's in John, it's in Q, and in the best verse is John 1:45 and 46. Jesus is starting to build his group of disciples, and he gets Philip, and Philip goes and finds his friend Nathanael, And he says, and he finds Nathanael and he says, come on, we found him about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote. Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth. This is the guy. We need to go follow him. And Nathanael says, can anything good come out of Nazareth? It's like, what? No, what are you talking about, Jesus of Nazareth? That's ridiculous. That's kind of that embarrassment thing. It's like, you want your great Messiah to come from some podunk little town in northern Israel? That's ridiculous. That's not where kings and messiahs come from. And again, if we look at the map here of, the Sea of Galilee, here's Nazareth. It's just a little town out in the middle of nowhere. There was a slightly bigger town. We talked about this a little bit about Sepphoris that was, a half a day walk away from Nazareth that, it was a little more cosmopolitan, but, it was no New York City or London for sure. It was, they had more than one grocery store probably. Okay. So Jesus was from Nazareth. That's a pretty solid fact, despite what you read in the, I won't talk about the birth narratives. We'll get to that in a minute. The other big thing was, we talked about it earlier, Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. Again, independently attested by multiple sources, consistent with the criteria of dissimilarity. It's like, Jesus is a follower of John? That doesn't make sense. And in Mark, John goes out and says he's baptizing for the repentance of and the forgiveness of sins. My baptism is for repentance and for the forgiveness of sin. If Jesus is God and divine, why does he need to be baptized for the forgiveness of sins? Why is he following this guy? That doesn't make sense. What you start seeing is things changing. Mark, it's pretty straightforward. He goes, he gets baptized, moves on. There's not a lot of discussion. Matthew, you get to John's like, oh, there's one coming who's greater than I am. And then he sees, I'm not even worthy to untie his sandals. And then Jesus comes and he says, he's like, you need to baptize me. And John's like, no, I can't do that. You should be baptizing me. Matthew says that. John takes that even further. Luke writes this whole birth narrative about how John and Jesus are cousins, and they kind of grew up together, and that's why they just kind of did stuff together. These are all developments to try to explain, to fit into their theological point, why Jesus would have been a follower of John. But most of the scholars will say, this is just one of those inconvenient facts. Jesus was probably started out as a follower of John. John was described as, in multiple sources, including those outside, as kind of this crazy, wild-haired prophet living out in the desert, eating locusts and wearing a coat of camel's clothes. And he was pretty radical and just kind of one of those wackos out in the desert doing his thing. And Jesus probably started out as one of his disciples or one of his followers before embarking on his own ministry. Interesting. Puts Jesus in a different mindset when you start thinking about what that actually means to get baptized by John.
God's voice in the dove, was that across different?
That's in multiple versions. In Mark, the dove comes down and the voice says, "This is the Son of God." Only Jesus hears that voice. So it's all of a sudden in Mark, he's baptized and Jesus hears this voice that only he heard. And then by the time you get to later Gospels, everybody hears it. And I think some of that is to try to drive home the point that, hey, from the very beginning, Jesus was being announced by God, and all these other people knew that he was divine because of that. So I see that whole dove story as trying to drive home Jesus' divinity, and it gets expanded to try to counter the idea that other people knew that as well as Jesus knew it. Jesus was an itinerant teacher and maybe a healer, question mark. We talked about miracles last week, and it's kind of tough to talk about miracles, but he, all through the sources, Jesus moves around from village to village. He talks about to his disciples, if you come to a village and start to talk to them and they don't want to have anything to do with you, then just shake the dust off your sandals and move on to the next village. He's constantly moving around the Sea of Galilee. He's in Capernaum, he's in Bethsaida. He goes back to his hometown and nobody believes him. They're like, why? Who are you? He comes in and starts talking in the synagogue and they're like, wait a minute, you're the Joseph's kid and you don't, what are you telling us all these things? You don't know anything. You grew up with us, and then which brings the famous verse, a prophet in his own is always rejected in their own hometown. And this is also very consistent with the context because there's a lot of wandering messiahs and prophets and rabbis, such as John the Baptist, who are moving around and doing this in the first century Roman Empire. Here's just one. Let me just tell you this little story. From the beginning, this one, his mother knew that he was no ordinary person. Before his birth, a heavenly figure appeared to her, announcing that her son would not be a mere mortal, but would be divine. His birth was accompanied by supernatural signs. He was a spiritual authority. He left home and began an itinerant preaching ministry. He went from village to village, sharing his message of good news, proclaiming that people should not worry about material things and instead focus on their souls and their eternal life. He gathered a number of disciples. They were amazed by his miraculous deeds and healings. They became convinced that he was the Son of God. He healed the sick, cast out demons. And then after his death, his followers proclaimed that he had appeared to them alive, that they had touched him and they had eaten with him. And eventually they wrote down all these stories. Have you read those stories? I doubt you have, because this is not Jesus. This is Apollonius of Tyana, who was a first century Greek philosopher, who has a very similar pedigree and background as Jesus. And he was kind of a contemporary, but he was doing his thing. Jesus was doing his thing. There are lots of would-be messiahs wandering around the Roman Empire at this time. So just to fall back and say Jesus was an itinerant preacher, that makes a lot of sense in that first century context. So most people think that is historical as well. And while we can't talk about miracles per se, because miracles by definition are outside the context of science and history to discuss, we can say that Jesus was known as a miracle worker, particularly a healer. In the gospel, there are 32 independent, separate miracle stories or sign stories. John calls them signs. He doesn't call them miracles. The other synoptic gospels call them miracles. Out of these 32 miracles, 25 of them are related to healing. So the vast majority of these miracle stories are about healing the sick, curing people who are blind, curing lepers, casting out demons, which most people would probably say were maybe people with, I count those as healings because they were maybe schizophrenic or mental illness or something like that. So there's a lot of discussion and debate. Some scholars, and I would say it's probably evenly split, some scholars are like, nope, all these miracle stories are simply there to drive home theological purposes, while others say, no, there's enough of them, and they're independently attested enough to say that maybe he did, or at least had the reputation for healing people. I think it's clear to say he had the reputation for healing people. But talking about the Christology, by the time you get to the Gospel of John, he has really changed these miracle stories and has used them not as just kind of, in Mark, Jesus is like walking along, healing people. He goes and he's teaching in the house, and the people dig out the ceiling of the house and lower their friend down on the mat because they can't get to Jesus. The woman who's been bleeding for 10 years, reaches out in the crowd and just touches the hem of his cloak, and Jesus is like, feels something happen. He's like, hey, who touched me? What happened? And so you get these stories that are just kind of things that are happening. They just are kind of happening. For John, every single one of the miracles is a sign. It's a sign to drive home the theological point that Jesus is God. So he doesn't do nearly as many, but the ones he does do are there for a very specific theological point that kind of caps off what the preceding chapter or two has been talking about. So it's John, out of all these, is probably the least historical, but it's probably the best written from a literary standpoint. We also, it's very well attested that Jesus taught in parables. So when you read the parables, many of those are likely going back to Jesus. And in fact, some of these, the parable of the mustard seed, you have to have faith the size, disciples say, how much faith do I have to have? And he's like, think of it like a mustard seed, which are, if you've ever gone to the spice aisle in Publix, the mustard seeds are really, really tiny. You take this little tiny mustard seed and put it out, and then the bush that grows out of that is this big giant bush. So he's like, all you need is a little bit of faith, and it'll grow and blossom into this big thing that affects. And that is one of the most oldest parables. Scholars have kind of looking at the language and where it falls in the record, in the manuscript record. And it's also one that most likely goes back to Jesus. The same with the parable of the sower. I'm out sowing the seeds. Some of them fall on rocks. Some of them fall on the road. Some of them fall on good soil. That parable, the parable of the wicked tenants, who they owe the owner money, and the owner sends people to collect the money, and they keep killing them, and then he sends a son, and then they kill his son. That parable is most likely a historic parable of Jesus. Two of my favorite, the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son, the jury's a little bit out on that. If you look at the scholarship on that, it's kind of evenly divided. Some don't buy it, others do buy it as being historic and going back to Jesus. I think all scholars would say that it's definitely in line with Jesus's teaching and how he taught, and the themes that are being discussed are the same themes that are getting discussed in these earlier parables. So from that standpoint, there's some consistency, but kind of like the letters of Paul. Was it written by someone after? And it's like, man, this is a perfect example of what Jesus would have said, and they stick it in there, or is it something Jesus said? You can't say with as much certainty as you can with some of these other parables. Jesus, the other thing that we can say for sure is he had a number of disciples, and of all types. He had his core group. There's 3 or 4 of these guys. I mean, all their names are listed, but you keep hearing about Peter, James, John over and over and over again in the Gospels. They're well attested. The other 12, you get their names in a list, but you don't really hear that much about them a lot of the time. There's a lot of, but the other thing in addition to that, there's this tradition that there were 12 disciples. That's probably a theological, anytime you see the number 12 or 7 or 12 in the Bible, there's some theological stuff going on there. 12 tribes of Israel, 7 days of creation. Most scholars take that, and 40 is another one. 40 is kind of these numbers that have more theological meaning than actual meaning. So, but he clearly has a lot of disciples. He has women who follow him. He spends his time talking. In fact, the longest this is a really interesting fact. The longest recorded in any of the Gospels where Jesus has a conversation. So he's up on the Sermon on the Mount, and he goes on for like 5 chapters teaching Sermon on the Mount. But a one-on-one conversation, the longest conversation he has in any of the Gospels is with the Samaritan woman at the well. By far, it's like 3 times longer than any other conversation that's recorded of Jesus. The women were the ones who were the first ones to go to the tomb. They were the first witnesses to the resurrection. That is really important, I think. So he clearly has an association with women who in the ancient world had no status, had no rights. They were not considered useful for anything except having children. He hung out with the tax collectors. These were Jewish people who were working for the Romans, collecting taxes, collecting the oppressive taxes, many would say, from the Jewish people to send back to Rome. And the Jews taught of them as traitors, as turncoats. They were despised. But Jesus constantly is talking with them. He's constantly talking to, associating with lepers. He's constantly associating with people who are viewed to be unclean. So that kind of big picture, there's multiple attestations of all of that throughout the Gospels. And then the last one is, we talked a bit about at the crucifixion, but Jesus comes in and overturns the tables in the temple. It's attested in both the Synoptics and John. It's not a behavior that's consistent with Jesus's earlier actions and speech. So when you read the Gospels, sometimes he's teaching and he's talking about love and turn the other cheek and walk a mile with your neighbor. This is him overturning the tables. I love this story personally because it really drives home that human part of Jesus. He sees what's going on and he gets pissed, and he's just like, what the hell are you guys doing? You're turning this temple into a den of thieves. Bart Ehrman, who's a famous scholar of New Testament from the University of North Carolina, his view of Jesus is that he's kind of this apocalyptic prophet out predicting the end of the world, the coming kingdom of God, and that this whole story fits in perfectly. If that's who Jesus was, this turning over the tables fits in perfectly with that kind of preaching. It's just like, what the heck are you guys doing? You got to get ready for the coming in. And when God does come, all of you will be judged harshly for it. So I think this is one of those other inconvenient truths that the early Jesus followers couldn't deny. They were just kind of stuck with it. There's a long list of things that are not in any way historical. The birth narratives are not historical. They are they're singly attested. The Matthew narrative is only in Matthew. The Luke narrative is only in Luke. They have no relevance to the rest of the gospel. Nowhere does in the book of Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, do they go back? Remember when I had to go to Egypt for 3 years, and then because Herod was trying to kill all the babies? Never comes up anywhere. A lot of scholars think that like the Luke narrative, the Matthew narrative, the wise men come and they bring frankincense and myrrh. Well, those are all the oils and the ointments that you usually use to embalm people with after they've died. And so there's a well-attested view that the women went to the tomb to cover Jesus's body with the spices, and they're like, well, these are all kind of poor itinerant people from Galilee. Where are they going to get the money for these kind of things? And so in the birth narrative, these Eastern kings come and bring it to Jesus, kind of foreshadowing his ultimate death as in the early stories. So not very super interesting, lots of cool theology in there, not historical. Virgin birth, not historical. In fact, it kind of contradicts what Paul says, because Paul is pretty clear that he was born of a woman. He was human. It wasn't, and you don't just become. You would think he would have said something if that was really important. The raising of Lazarus, Pontius Pilate waffling on whether to execute Jesus, that has no contextual credibility at all. Pilate, from all the things we know from there's a whole other group of ancient sources, and he was constantly antagonizing and oppressing the Jewish people. He had no problems in killing a few Jews here and there to drive home the point that he's the governor and the power of Rome is in his hands. In fact, that's the whole reason he gets sent out of Israel, is because his brutality got to the point that finally there was like this kind of uprising, and all the wealthier Jews appealed to his higher up governor and said, you got to do something about this guy. So him kind of saying, I don't know, he seems innocent to me, I kind of like him, having these long conversations. I think the Mark story is rings the most true. He kind of comes in, asks him a few questions, and is like, all right, off with you, you're going to crucify him. The guard at the tomb, we talked last week when we went through the resurrection narratives, and there's these guards in the book of Matthew, guards in the tomb. It only is in that book. It's not anywhere else. Any speculation as to why Matthew would have said, hey, we're going to seal up the tomb? And remember, when we got there, it was still sealed, and the guards were still standing there. Any speculation as to why Matthew would have included that in his story? Pardon?
To explain it?
To explain it, but the other stories are kind of like it had already happened. There seems to have been a development in the early church of anti-Christians or people working against Christians that are like, you keep talking about how he got raised from the dead. His disciples, they just went and took his body and got rid of it somewhere else and then said that he got raised from the dead. Come on. And so most scholars think Matthew is putting this little incident in to drive home the point that, hey, his followers didn't take the body because the tomb was still sealed when the women got there, and there were 2 Roman centurions there to make sure nobody was messing with it. And it was clearly a miraculous event. So to kind of counteract the narrative or the stories or the accusations of tomb robbing to drive home a theological point is why most scholars think that story is in Matthew. Super interesting. Wow, look at that. And we're only like 3 minutes over. All right. I hope this was interesting. Some of it was a little in the weeds. No class next week, but then the week after, what I want to do is we're going to go back up. These are kind of the things that Jesus did, and we want to kind of go back through and talk about the stories that Jesus told and what his teaching style and the things he said. Some are pretty accurate, some are maybe not so historical, and whether they actually fall, where they fall in there. And I think you'll be surprised. There's some beloved stories that we all as Christians love to tell. One of my personal favorites that most likely is not historical and almost didn't make it into the final version of the gospel. So yeah, should be kind of interesting. I'll be interested. I don't know about you guys. All right, thank you guys so much. Have a great week. We'll see you all in 2 weeks.